Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Wednesday, October 29th, 2025. I'm doing the news and views one day early because it's kind of a flash news and views. I have just been made aware of this, but before we get to get to this, it's kind of a fun news and views, but it's also serious too. But before we get to that, just a reminder there is no vid chat this coming Friday for Halloween. Everybody's going to be out trick or treating, so there's not really much of a point for us to have a vid chat. So that will mean the next vid chat will be, I think, scheduled for a week from this Friday. Check the schedule to make sure because I forgot to do it before I started this recording. Now, let's get right down to business. I just blogged today. You can go on the website and look at the blog about the theft of the French crown jewels from the Louvre about, I think, on October 19th. So it's been not too long. And in that blog, I advanced the idea that there's much about this story that just does not seem or fit right to me. Not the least of which is that I think there is a possibility that this may be more than just a robbery. Because when you're stealing a nation's crown jewels, you're stealing symbols of that nation's state itself. So I actually advanced the idea that perhaps the theft was because someone was either going to hold them hostage and trade the crown jewels back to the French government, bauble for bauble, or bauble for policy change, or what have you. So in other words, I advanced the idea that the theft may in fact have been politically motivated. Now, in a wider context, a friend of mine and I have been for some time privately discussing what we have been calling the royalist thesis. And we actually expanded that to our friend and colleague that does his own podcast, Bernard Grover, in Indonesia, where we've been noticing this unusual thing happening among the world's royalties. To give you an example, when the new Japanese emperor Naruhito was officially coronated for, I think, the very first time in Japanese history, the ancient Japanese Shinto ceremony of the installation of a new emperor and his consort was actually videotaped and broadcast. So you could actually see this very old ritual of the installation of a Japanese emperor. And I thought, well, that's very unusual that the Japanese would do that. And even more recently, the newest Japanese prime minister that we've just seen take office in the last few days, her credentialization and receipt of the credentials from Emperor Naruhito was also made available on YouTube. Now, that's a little symbolic thing. These are not major things in themselves. But look at Russia. When you turn to modern Russia and you see the symbols that surround Mr. Putin, for example, the symbols are actually very carefully displayed symbols of the old pre-Soviet tsardom and autocracy. The double-headed Romanov eagle is proudly displayed on those Russian flags behind Mr. Putin on many occasions. The other thing you'll notice is that the guards inside the Kremlin in their dress uniforms, those dress uniforms are 19th century uniforms, early 19th century uniforms, that as far as I can tell or make out, are deliberately designed to either replicate or look like the guard uniforms of the old Preobrazhensky Prikat, which was the Tsar's personal regimental honor guard. So in other words, you're seeing, my point here is you're seeing a return of royalist and imperial symbols in the trappings of power in these modern nation states. Look at Germany. I commented at some length on the website in a few blogs that the German government actually rebuilt the old Stadtschloss in Berlin on its the same territory that it used to occupy before the fall of Berlin at the Second World War. Well, what's the Stadtschloss? Well, that's the state palace. It was the palace of the Kaiser before World War One. And it was torn down at the end of World War II by the Soviets to build their palace of New Soviet Man or some such nonsense with an ugly modernist monstrosity. Well, that monstrous monstrosity was torn down, and the Germans rebuilt the facade of the old Stadtschloss, and in fact they crowdfunded it, which is unusual. So you have yet another return of an imperial symbol squatting right in the middle of the old governmental quarter in Berlin. So you put it all together, and it looks like there's all these little hints of the returns of the symbols of royalty. So then we had the theft of the French crown jewels in the Louvre. And I just literally came into the office here and opened my email, and I received the following article from a great deal of you. And I had no idea that this had appeared. This is an article, and I want you to listen to this article very carefully. I'm going to read a lot of it. It's very short. It appeared in Newsweek magazine, October 16th, 2025, exactly 3 days, I think, before the theft of the Imperial French crown jewels from the Louvre. Okay? The article is titled, listen to this, folks. The article is titled, "A New King of France, Louis XVI Descendant, Says He's Ready," unquote. And I'm going to read the first few paragraphs from this article because it is very, very serious in one sense, and it's very tongue-in-cheek in another. So here we go. This article is by John Tower, and it begins as follows, quote, "A descendant of France's last king has said that he is ready to serve his country as President Emmanuel Macron's latest government faces mounting political pressure. Louis de Bourbon, Duke of Anjou, and heir to France's last reigning monarch, Louis XVI, has spoken out amid the ongoing political turmoil in the country, which has seen its 8th prime minister appointed under Macron's tenure and the 4th since parliamentary elections in July last year. In an interview with the French newspaper Journal du Dimanche, Bourbon, age 51, also known as Louis XX, sounded the alarm on the precariousness of the Fifth Republic under the current administration, warning that the country's institutions and political class, quote, are not up to the challenges of the times. It is with pain that I see my country sink into a political crisis every day a little more insoluble, where once again parties and politicians, far from acting for the best interests of France and therefore of the French, prefer to play their own game," unquote, he warned. Now, just stop and ponder that statement. This is the heir apparent to the House of Bourbon saying that the current system in France is unstable and it is not looking out for the best interests of the country. Now, if it were an ordinary person on the street, we'd tend to dismiss them, and if it were even an ordinary politician, we'd tend to dismiss them. But this is actually coming from the head of the House of Bourbon-Poisson. Okay, in other words, this is the head of the old French royal family that is saying these things. So the article in Newsweek continues, and I want to point out a couple more statements. It continues, quote, faced with increasingly violent expressions of social and economic tensions at home and accumulating threats abroad, the Duke vowed to step in should his countrymen demand it. Quote, at the time of choice, I hope that the monarchical legacy of which I am the custodian is still sufficiently alive in the hearts of my compatriots to be a source of inspiration and, I say, of hope, unquote, he said. Now, don't get me wrong. I think this guy has about as much chance of being asked or requested to assume or reassume the title of the King of France, because that would require a constitutional change, an actual end to the Fifth Republic and the drafting of a new constitution. But by the same token, it is clear that this man is representing a tendency, a cultural tendency, of increasing frustration by Frenchmen with the direction their country has taken under Mr. Globaloney and with the immigration crisis and so on and so forth. So where all of this is going to end up, I don't know, but it's clearly playing to this royalist thesis that my friends and I have been privately discussing. How would you engineer a return, let's just say for hypothetical purposes, how would you engineer a return of the monarchies of Europe? Well, you do so by proving the inefficacy and incompetence and, in some cases, the actual treason of these Republican governments as they no longer govern with the best interests of their people in mind. And this is a sentiment growing throughout Europe. But now, here comes the real whopper in this article. Quote, the intervention comes as an Ipsos poll conducted before the current political turmoil warns that most people in France, let me say that again, Ipsos poll warns that most people in France do not think the current democratic system works, unquote. In other words, the perception now among Frenchmen, and I would aver that these are the Frenchmen that are fed up with Macron. These are the Frenchmen that are flocking to Marine Le Pen's National Party and so on. I suspect that this statement in itself is a little bit of confirmation of this royalist hypothesis. How do you reinstall those royal houses in those countries? Well, you create massive chaos and show the inefficacy of these governments. It's either that, folks, or it's a turn to dictatorship. And we've seen in recent history in Europe that went very, very wrong very quickly. Whereas, if you extend the royalist thesis for a little bit, during the 19th century, those royal families were able to keep, they certainly weren't able to avoid war, but they were able to keep things more or less fairly stable until, of course, it all collapsed with the outbreak of World War I. So this is not necessarily a serious development in France. Because, like I say, I think this guy has about as much chance of being asked to become the King of France as Mrs. Macron has a chance of. Well, never mind. I won't go there, but I think you all catch the drift. But it's nevertheless an interesting development, particularly in the context of the theft of the imperial French crown jewels a few days after this leader of the House of Bourbon made these statements to the Journal du Dimanche in France. So one story to watch, perhaps for those of you who are following the royalist thesis or the royalist hypothesis, definitely one to file away and to keep watching. So that will do it for this week's early news and views from the Nefarium Flash recording. Remember, we do not have a vid chat this Friday for Halloween. I do have an interview coming up the following Saturday, I think, on Dark Journalists, so you can tune into that on Saturday evening. So we'll see you on the flip side, everybody. Bye-bye, and God bless.